I said, my name is Ruth Fennell. I'm a dairy advisor based in the Teagasc office here in Dungarvan in Waterford, and I'm joined by my colleagues Owen Power and Eamon Lynch here this evening, and a number of the other staff members from both the Waterford and Kilkenny office. On behalf of the team, I'd like to thank you for joining us and welcome you to our winter seminar. We have two really great speakers up for you this evening. Firstly, we will have Anne Quinn, who's a veterinary inspector with the Department of Agriculture. And Anne is working in the area of TB. Not only will you be meeting Anne, I suppose, if you maybe have an outbreak, God forbid, of TB, but also in relation to a lot of preventative work we're looking into at the moment, and trying to reduce the incidence and outbreaks of TB. And what Anne is going to go through with you this evening is to explain some of the incidents of what's been happening, how those outbreaks have maybe occurred, and steps that you can take towards trying to prevent that or reduce the incidence of it with your own farm as well too. Second up then we have one of our specialists, Stuart Childs, who's based in Moore Park. And what Stuart is going to go through with you today is a little bit in relation to the legislative movements around calves, and a little bit in relation to preparing for calving and calf space requirements and that coming forward for the upcoming calving season for 2023. So without further ado, I will hand over to Anne and like to thank you for joining us. Just to let you know, this seminar is being recorded. There's a chat box at the bottom of your screen. You can see either the chat box or the Q&A box. So at any stage, if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to do that, and we'll answer them when Anne has finished her presentation. Okay, so please feel free at any stage, if you have any questions, just pop them into the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll answer them for you as we progress through. All right, I'll hand over to you, so Anne, thank you very much.
Okay, look, I'd like to thank Ruth just for having me here this evening to speak with you all. We're delighted. My name is Anne Quinn. I'll introduce myself first. I've come in as the Superintending Veterinary Inspector for the Waterford Kilkenny area. And my primary role, I suppose, is the management of the ERAD program in both counties. Now, I've come across Milliscorthy, and I suppose we had a very high incidence of TB in that area, so we're very experienced, I suppose, in the management of TB outbreaks. So I suppose what we're trying to do, I suppose, with today's meeting, I was delighted that Ruth had contacted. I've met with the farming bodies, and I've met with Teagasc, I suppose, in the last quarter of this year, and we're looking, I suppose, at improving and enhancing our communication with the stakeholders in relation to the management of TB on farm. And I suppose we're looking at two types of farmers: the farmers that are in breakdown and the ones that aren't in breakdown, the clear herds. Go through this presentation on TB. So the first slide there that you have on your screens just shows the national picture. Now you'll see Waterford Kilkenny there, and you'll see that North Kilkenny has a very red dot sitting there. And looking at the screen, at the very top of the screen there, you'll see it's color coded for incidents. Now, we were doing very well, and the incidence of TB from the time we started managing, I suppose, TB in the 1950s right up until now, we've gone down to about 4%. But it is quite worrying that in 2017, if you see there on the bottom of the screen, we were at 3.41% of the national herd in restricted at any one time. And we are moving slowly up. It's at 4.33% at the moment. Now, and again, if you look at herds restricted, you know, at the moment, the 20th of November in 25,000 are 4,575. Now that looks like we've gone down a lot, but if you look at the reactor numbers, what we're finding is the number of, while we have the number of breakdowns are certainly reducing, the number of reactors per individual breakdown is going up. And if you look there at the herd incidence, you know, we're at 430 down to 412, you know, on that there. So it looks, you know, that we're winning on the herd sizes, but within those herds that go into breakdown, you know, there can be catastrophic breakdowns. So I suppose our role now is to look at, you know, what's causing this increase in I suppose the number of reactors in individual herds, and is there anything additional that we can do at this stage to improve that they can make informed decisions in relation to how they manage their farming practices around the risk of TB. And I suppose it's a little bit different to what we've been doing till now, because normally you would really only interact with the RVO, and my team, I work with veterinary staff and technical staff, and wildlife officers, and I suppose the administration team in relation to the management of TB breakdown. If you look at Waterford versus the national incidence here, you're looking at, the national incidence is running just along the four. There certainly is peaks of outbreaks in Waterford, and that's a concern. And then if we move down to the next screen, again, the red line is Waterford RVO, and the linear line is where we do expect the average to be. And you can see there's week on breakdowns. So just to keep it, I suppose, local, I'll show you Kilkenny as well. Now, Kilkenny is certainly moving up. There's a large number of breakdowns in Kilkenny at the moment, and we're actively managing the situation there. Waterford is a little bit different in that we have very large sporadic breakdowns at the moment with individual herds, and we're managing those case by case. Kilkenny is sort of working more as a cluster, and we're working with a large number of farmers in that area, and we're actively managing the situation there. And I'll just go down there, and these just were Kilkenny's national incidence. We're certainly in Kilkenny moving from the 4.12% or 6.13%, which is very concerning. So I suppose to go back to, you deal with us in the RVOs if you have a breakdown. You do your round tests once a year. You might be asked as either dairy or suckler farmers or beef farmers to do additional testing over the year, but at a minimum, every farm in the country is tested once a year on the TB programme. And I suppose you look at, well, how is bovine TB spread? It's a respiratory pathogen. We do know that. So it's spread from contact with infected animals. It's spread by moving infected animals into previously, clear herds or into previously clear herds. It's from contact with infected wildlife or contact with other infected animals across fences or shared watering points or residual infection. I'll come back to that because that's really important. Consuming contaminated food, water, or milk, or sharing machinery. Now, it's really important to realize that TB is very multi disease to manage. We've been trying to deal with it, I suppose, for the last 50 years, or more, and there's been a huge amount of resource, work put into it. So it's not one simple thing. There's a huge collection of variables, and I suppose at farm level, we're really focused now on managing the risk of TB spread and TB introduction in clear herds. Because if you get a notice in the post that one of your neighbours is down with TB, I suppose what we're looking at now is, is there anything you can do now to make sure that, you're going to minimize your risk of going down with TB as well. So it's really important to realize farm and how it can be introduced to your farm. So if you look at, breeding contaminated air, in particular at housing, if you have a TB infected animal and it goes in, you'll say at this time of year now, when all of your cows are in calf, whether they're sucklers or dairy cows, they're sharing the same airspaces, they're very close together. I think we're all very familiar with COVID, the talk about, close contact and, breathing in, I suppose, the virus for COVID, but TB pretty much spreads the same way. Now, it's a disease, a very slow growing, it's a very individual disease in individual animals. So not every animal will react the same way, but we do know for definite that animals who are under pressure, that are immunocompromised, will develop TB and develop open TB a lot quicker. In a normal animal, TB is introduced, the animal will fight it off with their immune systems, and it'll be walled off into the lymph nodes, generally in the lungs. And if that animal becomes stressed or, immunocompromised, that's when it can become an open TB infection. And every breath that animal takes is spreading TB into the airspace. Now that's at housing, that's critical, because if you have one animal sharing the same airspace, and we have in all our sheds now, all the animals are in together, but the compounding factors are generally the cows are all pregnant. Pregnant animals, we've all learned that, same as in COVID, that pregnancy certainly will cause an immunosuppression. So pregnant animals are very vulnerable to the spread of TB, and that's why we're getting massive outbreaks of TB in, we'll say, pregnant animals, either both sucklers and dairy herds in the winter period. So it's really important that the animals that are going in, there's good ventilation, and that that you're clear that any animals that you've brought in, that you're happy to, that they've been isolated, and that you're happy to put them in with your animals. Now, moving in infected animals. Now, I think everybody has gotten their text message on the new TB requirements coming in with very, I suppose, conscious that it is going to be an additional cost on farmers. It's going to be an additional hassle. But what we would say to you that it is really a big bonus that if you're buying in animals, that they have been tested and that you can be confident that they are clear and they've gone through a good intradermal skin test, and you can be reasonably confident that you're not introducing TB into your herd from another herd. Now, contact with infected wildlife. Now, thankfully in Waterford and Kilkenny, wildlife generally means badgers. I mean, I worked in Escorthy, and we worked a lot in the East Wicklow area where and North Wexford, where deer certainly were causing, a good part of our problems in the residually infected herds. It isn't as much of a problem, I suppose, in Kilkenny, and certainly there is some wildlife, some deer interactions in Waterford, but we're reasonably confident at the moment that really badgers are our talk for infected wildlife. Now, I think, well, the next slides will talk about how badgers interact with cattle. But I think the most important thing I can say to you from an RVO level is I think that to now our communication, I suppose, with yourselves hasn't been great from the wildlife unit, because I think the Stop Tell and the Badger app tells all the farmers, and I think there was another app message that went out there last week, and it says, that you're to stop animals, I suppose, interacting with wildlife, and you're to tell us. But what I didn't really say, which we really wanted to get across, was that we want you to fence off the sets, and it's not to fence in the badgers; it's to ensure that those badgers that are living in the hedgerows, they're protected species, will not come in contact with your cattle. We have a vaccination program in place, and basically the vaccine reducing the incidence of TB in the badger population and maintaining a healthy, stable badger population in the hedgerows. And that's really important because, if you have infected wildlife and your cattle have access to the sets, cattle are very nosy. And if there's spoil heaps coming out from the badger sets, badgers are very susceptible to TB. Their immune systems work at a very, very low level because they're largely underground. So it's really important to realize that if a badger contracts TB, and they will pick it up from cattle, from close contact with farm animals, those badgers will move to generalized TB very quickly in under 2 to 3 months. And everything that they excrete or secrete, that means all their I suppose their urine and the feces that they pass to mark their latrines around your farm, with that, it is very likely that the cattle will pick up TB from the wildlife. Now, it does go both ways. If your animals have TB and the badgers in the hedgerows don't have TB, if they're coming in contact with each other, the badgers will become infected as well. So it's just really important to realize that it's not to fence the badgers out, it's to fence the badgers away from your animals and fence your animals away from the badgers. So the next one is contact from other infected animals. Now, I'm very conscious that the vast majority of farms, that isn't an issue. Any farmer that has gone through a herd number application will know that the first thing that you'll be asked for is biosecure perimeter fencing. So what we're really looking at that is that if you're sharing watering points or there's residual infection coming in. So our theory at the moment with contiguous infection is really that farms are sharing the wildlife, and the wildlife is moving, in between fields and in between herd numbers. Now, the next one is consuming contaminated food, water, or milk. Now, that's a really, really important one, because if you've got an infected reservoir of wildlife on your farm or in your neighbours' farms, because badgers can move up to a kilometre to kilometre and a half from main sets, and they will travel quite long distances. If the badgers are sick, or they've become infected with TB, access farmyards, they will access water points and fields. And it is really, really important that you realise that a badger with TB, if they're sharing the same water space, or they're eating your beet or coming in to eat the maize, around your cattle, and we have cameras that show that the cattle become very used to them. They come in at night, you won't see them, they're very shy animals, but everything that they slobber all over the beet and the maize, or if they like to get into the water points, they like to wash, but they do fight. They're very territorial animals. And if they fight and they have TB, you'll get discharging TB abscesses around their necks, and they will cause a point source contamination into any water or feed areas for the animals that come in contact with that. So that's really important to realize that, contaminated food, water, is a big part of our investigations now in relation to TB outbreak. Can make a huge difference in managing your risk at farm level, of preventing your animals contracting TB from infected wildlife. Now, sharing machinery, and that's really your cattle trailers, lorries, your mucks, lorry spreaders. Now, we're all very conscious that everybody is using contractors more and more. And I think contractors are moving, freely within farms, and they do a great job, and they're very much needed. But I suppose it's just a point to ask you all to consider, do you really ask them to wash out? I suppose in particular the slurry spreaders, are they washing between farms? Are you getting half of somebody else's, slurry on your first run in the fields or vice versa? So I suppose it's just to have a little think at farm level. Is there anything you could do to ensure that, your contractors bring nothing in with them and they don't take anything off with them? And that goes to your basic biosecurity. Now we'll just go to the next there. So what we're looking at, I suppose, is TB risk management. And I suppose part of our mantra on this is communication with the stakeholders. And for my part, I think that, I suppose, the farmers and the farming community are our key stakeholders. You're the very people who have the animals on the farms, and you're the people who have the most to lose if you have a TB breakdown. So we have found, I suppose, if you're clear, people really aren't very interested in TB because, sure, it's not a problem and I won't worry about it until I have it. And I think I used a very good analogy to the other discussion groups in the last while. And I think all of us are very familiar with the GAA and how you manage, I suppose, the local GAA community pitch. And if you were to look at a TB today, the risk of TB on farms and the TB program, I ask you all, if you were to consider, the local GAA pitch, and it's a bit run down, and and there's no stands, and you haven't got a changing room, and you put in a huge investment, everybody does all of the suppose gathering up all the resources, and you do every kind of fundraising that ever was, and you put in a great pitch, you put in a new surface, you build all your stands, you put in the changing rooms, and the team are all togged out in New Year, and everybody's really fit and the game is on. And you have your rules. Now, in our case, the rules would be the annual TB test, but for the vast majority of farmers who are clear, the first time they ever consider the rules of TB is when they go into breakdown. And at that point, you come into contact with ourselves and the RVOs, and it's a huge shock because it is a massive financial blow to any family farm, whether you're in dairying or suckers, or beef, if you go down, in a round test, or you have, a TB lesion in the factories. So at the GA level, it's the equivalent that we land out, we stop the game, and we say, gosh, I don't, the surface lads, you could have, geez, I wouldn't like that surface, and maybe you should put the goalpost somewhere else, and God, the changing rooms, I'm not sure if I'd have put them there, and then we probably will take, a good portion of the team, and we'll expect you to play on. And you're saying, well, God, where were you when we were putting the pitch, and we were, doing all of our investment here, and we could have done with you and information at that time. So my role today, I suppose, is to highlight you when you're clear, when you're thankfully not in a breakdown, to know your risks and know your risks at farm level. And I suppose start considering what can you do at farm level to minimize your risks of being in that 4 to 6% of herds that are currently in breakdown. Because, we have gone from a situation where those breakdowns are taking 2 to 3 to 4 animals per breakdown to situations where 30 to 50 reactors, and that's a massive financial blow for any farm, and it's not sustainable. So it's manage the risks and hopefully don't go into breakdown. And it's, it's a great way to farm, that you know what you're doing, you're making informed decisions at farm level. So this slide, I suppose, is going through that. You're looking at your TB risks. Wildlife are up there. There are certainly a risk to introducing TB. Moving in animals. Now, we've had many discussions in the RVO on, I suppose, why the incidence at farm level is going up, and why we're getting so many reactors and individual breakdowns. And I suppose I'm old enough to remember brucellosis. And I think a lot of yourselves there would remember the controls we had in place for brucellosis. Now, movement of animals was a key risk in moving and spreading brucellosis farm to farm. And I think that would have also managed a lot of our TB risks as well, but we were really putting it in for brucellosis because it was the higher risk. But certainly what we've found now, since brucellosis thankfully has been eradicated, that farmers aren't as conscious and aren't as worried about moving in animals, that they don't see TB on their radar. And it's just really important to put it back up there on their radar. Now, the department have put a risk rating on herds, and I think it's really important to make the informed decision if you're buying in, to try and buy in from herds that haven't gone down in the last 4 to 5 years, if at all possible. And if you make the decision to buy them a little bit sooner, that you're taking additional risks and that you're going to keep an eye on those animals. And so we're not saying you can't buy them, but we're saying to have an awareness that it is a bigger risk of buying in TB or buying in a TB latently infected animal. Now, it's important to realize that TB is a disease of longevity. So animals that pass a TB test, can have early TB, or the TB can go into latency. And those animals will pass the test, a very small number, or animals that have been tested, 8 to 10 to 12 months ago, and they haven't been tested before you bought them in, and they've been exposed to TB before you bought them in. So it's just really important to be aware that it is a big risk to any herd if you're buying in animals, and to consider carefully where you're buying them and how you're going to manage them when they come into your farm. The same with neighbour spread, be conscious of your neighbours, and I suppose good fencing and no sharing of facilities. And if you do, make good biosecure decisions that, everybody disinfects in and disinfects out. And now, environment, I suppose if you're in breakdown, cleaning and disinfection is largely seen as a pain in the head more than a job that has got to be done and has value. But what I can say is, research has shown that, animals that have TB or TB reactor animals will shed a lot of TB into the environment. So it's really important that you keep the areas clean. And if you're in a breakdown herd, that the cleaning and disinfection is done very well. And then for the clear herds, just to make sure that you keep the place clean and tidy and no large buildups of organic manure, because if there is a problem and animals come in contact with it, the more they meet, the more likely they are to develop TB. And then back to your shared machinery. And I suppose that's again back to your contractors. And I suppose be conscious that they're moving from farm to farm and they take nothing in and take nothing away. And I think all of us were a lot more conscious of that when brucellosis was in the picture, because certainly I worked in practice over that time, and I would have found that the biosecurity was really good and farmers were very knowledgeable and very aware of the risks. So I think we need to put TB back up there as a risk to your herd, and basically sharing machinery and contractors is certainly something to consider how you're going to manage it going forward. Now, the last one there is poor quality TB testing. Now, again, what we have found is, look, as herds have gotten a little bit bigger, or farmers are very busy. And I think, the TB test is a test that has to be done once a year. And most people, if they're clear at seed, it's just something that has to be done to basically to be able to sell and buy cattle and to stay in business. Now, what we're, I suppose, trying to, engage with everyone to realize that poor quality testing, or if the facilities or the help isn't available for your vet to do that test properly. If your vet misses even one animal on that test, and that animal is in your herd, particularly over the critical winter housing period, when its immune system is a little bit lower if it's in calf, and if that animal develops open TB, you could potentially go from that one animal that should have been taken out in the previous test, taking out 20 or 30 in the next test, or de facto lesion, when you present animals for slaughter. So that TB test is your only way of knowing exactly what's going on in your herd from year to year, or if you have to do additional testing. And it is really important that you have good facilities, that you've got a good crush, and that you put time into getting it done properly, and you have the help and facilities available for your vet to do it properly. We have, I suppose, certainly a lot of evidence that would show that poor facilities and poor health, and cattle are all, everyone knows cattle are getting a little bit wilder. The suckler herd, is probably a little bit less handled, and they certainly, they're harder to manage year on year. So without good help, it is very difficult to do a good test. And it's the same in the dairy herds, running the cattle, through the crush after milking and leaving the vet out there on his own to do the test. Now, he'll get it done. He or she will get it done. Will he do as good a job as he could if he took your time and held on to them and got the test done properly? I would say no, to be perfectly honest. And we have found that getting everyone to slow down a bit, take the test seriously, and I suppose put a value on a clear test, and making sure that you stay clear and knowing exactly what's going on in your herd is really, really important, because that brings me back up to the very top, to the residual infection. And that's right up there with the wildlife, because that is your biggest risk. If you have poor testing or you have a big outbreak, it is very difficult to manage the within herd spread of TB in your herd. And it's really important that you've got good quality testing. If you go down a test, we will do additional testing with gift sampling. But the TB test is the gold star for testing. And if it's done properly, it reduces the risk of residually infected animals being left in your herd. That will basically mean that you stay in breakdown for longer and you lose more animals. So just go on there to the next slide now. So our focus at the moment is really on badgers. All of you would have gotten the app there on the WhatsApp text in the last week on the, you see it there, how to basically report in badger activity. Now, what at the RVO level we're trying to, I suppose, encourage every farmer is that ideally you should know what's going on, in your farm, in the hedgerows, and you should be in a position to at least make a stab at identifying all the sets in your land and the latrines. And the latrines are very important. Badgers are very shy and private animals. They stay in the hedgerows. They will very rarely go across main pasture unless they're looking particularly for earthworms, in around cow paths in times where there's a drought. But most times they stay in the headlands, and they do all their latrines and territory marking in the headlands. The few times you will find them, in the middle of the field, it's just a really important area to know what's going on. Now, what we would ask you to do is the latrines and those sets should be fenced off from your cattle. And it's even clear, because you don't know, I suppose, until now, people talk about continued herd testing. Your neighbour's down and you're going to be tested because you're right by it. But I think we're really trying to encourage everyone to realise that you're actually sharing the wildlife between 3 or 4 farms. And it's really important that you're managing the badgers on your farm and access from cattle to the wildlife, for both yourself and for your neighbours. And if everybody fences off the badger sets, the much less likelihood of going down or having any of you or your neighbours going down with the TB. So we're very focused on, I suppose, stop, tell. So the stop is to stop cattle getting to badgers to pasture. Now, fencing them off and fencing off the latrines, and there's a few pictures there. Now, they're quite distinctive, but they're very quiet animals and they're quite hard to tell. So what we're saying is, if you stop cattle and stop the badgers coming together, and then you tell ourselves, now the message I think has gotten lost in translation, because the tell part, our role is we run a badger vaccination or a badger culling program, depending on what area of the country you're in. And we will put that set on our wildlife maps, and we'll be out, and depending on what part of the country you're in, those badgers will either go on the vaccination program, or if there's large breakdowns or the area has a high incidence of TB, there will be some culling carried out of the sets. But if we don't know where the sets are, we won't be able to, I suppose, put in your badgers onto that. And also, we don't know where they are, and you don't know where they are. So we want, first of all, you to go look, and then stop, most importantly, fence them off, and really do your best to make sure that you can manage the wildlife on your farm for yourself and for your neighbours. So that for us right now, that is your biggest risk of TB at the moment. They maintain that wildlife access on farms at the moment is largely unmanaged. That it is a critical area that we could improve on immediately. Now, ourselves, I suppose, to explain, in the RVOs, we run a wildlife program. The badgers are in a vaccination program, and they are a protected species. So, and to understand a little bit on badger ecology, I'll just go down to the next slide there now. So, here we are now. Now, sorry about that. So, badgers will be called where they're linked to a TB breakdown, and we'll manage that within the RVOs when you go into a breakdown. And basically, it's our policy to move from culling to vaccination to prevent the spread of disease. Now, badgers are protected. There will never be a time where we will be able to, we would want or be able to remove all the badgers. Badgers, will live quite happily as stable, healthy populations in the hedgerows. and will pose no threat to the, I suppose, to the commercial farming around them if they're managed properly. And the vaccination program will manage that for us going forward. So the most important thing you could do is to look up the bovine tb.ie website. There's a huge amount of information, and to download that app. But I suppose, and while you download the app, I suppose it's to commit yourself to maybe walk the land, see what you have. If you're not sure what you have, give us a ring, and let us know what you found. But if you're confident about your set, let us know. Start fencing it off. And the same for the farmyards, to stop access badgers to commercial farms. Now, I'm just going to go to the next slide. Yeah. So if you look there, basically they would say
the next slide didn't come up yet.
It will infect 1 to 2 more badgers. If we get the badgers vaccinated, we'd be aiming that we. Oh, can you see it there?
No, the next slide hasn't come up. Now it's there. It's there now. Yeah.
My IT is a.
Go again. Now you have it. Yeah.
All
Wildlife
right.
program
Okay.
is coming up. Yeah.
Perfect. So it's to reduce. Yeah. Wildlife program. No, you're behind me. Then hold on. Where are you now? Is that it there?
We're on wildlife program now. So keep going again if you have it.
Ruth,
we're on wildlife program now with
okay.
badgers are cold, where they're linked
now,
to breakdown.
That's just next slide now should be coming up now.
It hasn't come yet, huh?
Well, I'll keep talking there. It's true, Ruth. It should come up.
Okay.
I think it's behind me. I'd say there's a delay.
It's come now.
On the screen.
It's gone to the next one. We're on reduce every badger.
Okay.
We're on now.
Okay, perfect. So it was just explained that how badgers will affect more badgers to sets. Now they also affect cattle, but basically to manage badger populations, I suppose there is a temptation, and we hear it, from farms, farmers that are in breakdown and they've experienced significant losses that say, well, sure, why can't we just take out all the badgers and be done with it? It's really important to realize that there's a very stable badger population within the country, and they work on territories. So if you remove your badgers, you're basically creating a vacancy for somebody else's badgers to come in. That's really important. They will come from a long distance. So you're really not gaining anything. And also you're stressing that population. And what we have clearly found is that with the motorways, with clear felling or anything that causes a disturbance to the badger population causes stress and movement of badgers. And it certainly is linked to more TB breakdowns. So our policy is to manage, I suppose, the badger population in the hedgerows, get them vaccinated, get the information in. Our teams are surveying, and with information from yourselves, we aim to get working towards getting up and beyond 50% of all badgers vaccinated to ensure that we've got herd immunity and the badgers don't pose any threat to commercial farming, in Ireland. So now just move on to the next one there. So the environmental risk, I spoke to you there on the 3 slides ago on environmental risk. Now, it's really important. TB will last in the environment for quite a considerable period of time. So, recurrent breakdowns, or if you have one large breakdown, you have to consider that you probably will have a huge amount of TB in the environment. So it's to know how to disinfect effectively. And there's a video up there on the bovine tb.ie, and there's a lot of information on that. And it's even for the herds that are clear, it's really good policy to, routinely disinfect and make sure that your sheds are clean. And if you're buying in animals, to make sure that, keep them isolated for a period of time, and make sure, and ideally now with the new animal health law, they will have to be tested within 30 days coming in if they're over 36 months anyway, or any breeding animals. But it is really important to use the cleaning and disinfection, I suppose, agents properly on your farms and minimize, I suppose, environmental contamination of TB, and that's where you're to routinely clean and disinfect. Okay, and I'll just now. So I think I've spoken at length there on the risk from cattle movement. And again, we have videos on that. Now this, I suppose, I'm not really going to go in too much into that. There's a lot of information to come to everyone on the new animal health law. And I think, look, it will certainly be a learning curve for all of us, because I think there will be a lot of difficulties with movements and discrepancies, because it will be difficult, I suppose, to consider how to manage. And I suppose our role will be, I suppose, to communicate I suppose, clearly to yourselves on what the requirements are, and I suppose, and to hopefully get the buy-in that everyone understands, I suppose, when to test and how to ensure that they can trade and maintain their trading status, you know, around the new testing requirements. But I suppose it's just to emphasize that the less movements that you have into your farm is really going to minimize your risks of introducing TB into your herd. So next one there, and I've gone through the good quality testing, and that's, you know, all we can say on that is look at, slow it down, take it seriously. It's a very valuable test, and it will save you a lot of money in the long run if it's done properly. And to put value time into it, and make sure that you help your vet as best you can, you know, to get the test and be very happy that he's doing it properly. Okay, and that's the last one there. We have a huge amount of information available on the bovinetb.ie website. And we're also available in the RVOs, that I suppose we're really focused into 2023 to engage more, I suppose, with the individual farmers as best we can, while we're not trying to manage individual TB breakdowns. But we're also trying to pull in the clear herds. You know, we want, I suppose, to interact better and more effectively with clear owners, and I suppose we're liaising with both the IFA in particular and Teagasc, I suppose, to look at how we can all work together, you know, as a collective to minimize the risks of TB farm level, and then farmers can work, you know, at farm level and make informed decisions on how they can manage TB risks on their own farms, and ideally stay here and I suppose only meet in the information evenings and not just when we're trying to break down on their farms. So thank you very much.
That's great, Anne. Thank you.
Oh, okay, and just a couple of questions after coming in. One of the questions is, there's a large increase of deer population in his area. What is the department's stance in relation to wild deer control and their role in the spread of TB?
Deer certainly have been linked to TB breakdowns, and I suppose I've come from East Wicklow for the last 3 years, and certainly they are linked there. Now, ERAD are working with other stakeholders. Deer are largely managed by, I suppose, Parks and Wildlife have an involvement. There's very, you know, and I suppose the Deer Hunters Association. So in real terms, in any farming area, what we would advise any farmer to do is to get the Section 42 license, you know, and cull and reduce numbers as much as you can. We have deer submission forms. We're happy to send as many as you can get to the labs. And what we would ask you to, I suppose, talk to your hunters and make sure that any hunting on your lands for deer, that the intestines and the respiratory systems, that they call the grolics, are managed properly. Because definitely there was a huge issue in East Wicklow that the deers were being post-mortems or cleared out, you know, on commercial farmland, and infected lungs and intestines left for badgers to become infected with TB, and also commercial cattle. So look, it is being actively looked at by both the department and Parks and Wildlife in Quilta, and I think look at thankfully that there is, I suppose, an understanding that the deer population does require some management and reduction. So it's an evolving picture, but it is a concern, and we are very aware of it.
Oh, okay, thanks. And next question that's after coming in is it known how much shared equipment, like slurry equipment, contributes to the spread, and is it significant?
It is certainly an established risk, and I suppose certainly over the last 10 years, I think we all have to acknowledge, I suppose, farms have gotten busier, and contracting is very much now the norm. So I suppose we're building up our information, you know, over time, you know, on individual breakdowns. And I suppose our information to date would say that it is certainly a link and it is a risk. So what we would say to every farmer is, you know, ideally you should be asking your contractors, they should rinse out coming in, you know, with disinfectant before they come onto your farms, or ideally they should rinse routinely when they're finished on one farm before they go to the next farm. You know, it's again just risk management.
Okay, thanks, Anne.
Okay.
From a buyer's point of view, there's a question here. Are there any plans to have the TB risk statute of herds available to the buyers?
Oh, I'm thinking, yes, I look at that, that's always out for discussion. Look, personally, I think it should be available. I think it's a really important, I suppose, piece of information for anyone buying in. So I think, look, there are ongoing discussions, and I would hope, that it will be available. I think that is certainly on the cards, and I think people shouldn't be afraid of it. Now, if you go down and you're trying to trade, it is very difficult to get back up to your C10. But I think, look, only 4 to 6% are currently in breakdown. And I think if you're buying in, you should be in a position to make informed decisions on what you're buying in. I think that's fair.
Okay, thanks. And one more question is, using buckets of licks for calves and fields, is that a risk for attracting badgers? The bucket
Yes.
licks.
Well, look, we are just, I suppose now, I can't emphasize enough that it is really important not to feed cattle on commercial farmland where badgers can access either the feed or the water. Now, we have one case ongoing at the moment. It's a dairy herd, and they put down lower water trucks solely for the calves. And that herd lost 30 calves, with generalized TB. The rest of the cows are all perfect. The badgers set, up one end of the fields. The badgers over drought were accessing calf feeders, the calf trucks right beside the big feeds for water. So definitely molasses, they love molasses. It's very close to ground. They will come, and they certainly will eat from it. So you should never have mineral licks at ground level out on fields, or feeders or water trucks. It's a really important one.
Okay, Ruth, that seems to be the questions to date anyway.
Great. Thank you very much for that. And a big thank you to Anne for joining us here this evening. Our next speaker up that we have is Stuart Childs. So I'll hand straight over to you, Stuart, without further ado. Are you okay to share?
Should be showing there now, hopefully.
Yeah. Just go into present mode.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Anne has obviously given you a very comprehensive rundown in relation to the TB side of things there, and many of you will probably have come on to hear Anne more so than to hear me. But to be honest, I won't have a huge amount of changes to tell you about, but there are some things that we probably do want to make people aware of. Is that showing okay, Ruth? Actually, it's just showing up on my screen maybe as a split mode there.
No, it's perfect.
Yeah. So while the title is Guidelines to Calf Movements for 2023 and beyond, I can really only tell you about calf movements for 2023 and maybe some little bits and pieces that are going to possibly come into play in 2024. Longer term, I suppose I don't have a crystal ball, but I will be, I suppose, alluding to some points in relation to that. Okay. So look, going back to the very basics, first off, very quickly through it. Calving, in terms of tagging requirements, we're going to have 1.6 million calves born on dairy farms in the next 6-7 months, basically. They need to be tagged within 20 days of birth, and obviously from a logistical point of view, from busy dairy farms, as Anne has spoken about there, they need to be tagged basically as soon as they're dry, really. Registered within 7 days, which when you add the two together means that they must be registered within 27 days of birth. And talking to some of the people in the district veterinary office and so forth, one of the big issues that they come across often is that 27-day problem, where people are just busy at the time and obviously forget to register the calves. So I suppose from trying to cover off that compliance point of view, I suppose people should be looking at the various apps that are available, and the department themselves have a calf registration app there that can be used, and obviously takes out the requirement maybe to post off registration certs or whatever to the department to get your calves back. And also then I suppose if we look at those people that will be trying to move calves quickly off the farm, the sooner the birth is registered, the sooner you'll get your blue card that will facilitate the movement of the calf. So as I said, Ruth asked me to talk about the movements in particular. So as it currently stands, it's not going to change for 2023. So if you're moving calves, they must be 10 days of age at least. That's for farm to farm or through the mart. And just, I suppose, to put that in very clear terms, at least 10 days of age means that the calf must be, can only move on the 11th day. So they actually have to be 10 days old the day they're moving, not on the 10th day. And the same is true for the export trade. So the export trade requires that the calves be at least 14 days old. So that means they can't actually move to export out on an export trade until they're 15 days of age. So I suppose it's just important to point out as well, COVID, obviously there was a welcome extension of the TB element there, and maybe it's come up several times, and actually maybe you might want to come in there later on in relation to that, that there was a question mark about obviously the test date went to 120 days during the course of COVID because of the close proximity that people would have to be in when testing calves, young calves obviously. So by giving the calves an ability or a chance to grow up, to be a bit older where they could be tested more easily without close interaction, the TB test requirement was increased to 120 days during COVID. But since September of last year, 2021, the 42-day rule was reinstated. So any calf that was over 42 days of age requires a TB test to be moved off the farm, regardless of the destination. And as I said, maybe Anne, you might come in there later on and just, it has come up at several meetings that I've been at, is there potential for that date to be extended, and what would be the impact in relation to TB? Now, obviously, the fact that it was reinstated, you would suggest that there's obviously a logic to it from the point of view of the risk of transfer of TB there. So look, as I said, this is speculation to a certain extent. So there's been a lot of talk in the last 2 to 3 years, I suppose, in relation to calf export and so forth. And 28 days of age has been an age that I've heard been talked about a lot. A very recent European Food Safety Authority report, also known as IFSA, has a paragraph in it which I put up here. So based on the synthesis of the available literature, the main welfare concerns relating to the transport of unweaned calves are reduced adaptive immunity, handling difficulties, transport stress, and health issues. Therefore, it is recommended that unweaned calves should not be transported until 5 weeks old. Sorry, there's a bit of a slight typo there. And at a minimum body weight of 50 kgs. So that's a recommendation that has come from this IFSA report. It hasn't been enforced into law or brought into any law as yet, but I put it in there just for people to see the trajectory of thinking behind movements of young stock, okay? And for anybody that was at the dairy conference yesterday, you would have seen that Emer Kennedy would have shown a graph showing that the immunity of the calf is compromised, I suppose, up to maybe beyond 14 days of age at least, which is probably the driver behind the 14, 15 days of age before movement and into the export market. And I'll look at that again a little bit more in detail at the very end of the presentation, just in relation to things that you can do to improve calf health on your farms. Exports wise, what changes are coming here? I suppose in 2022, DAFM's figures would say that up to the 31st of July, there was 221,838 cattle exported out of the country. They went to many, many different destinations. And of that 221,000 or 222,000, if we round it up, 166,000 of them were calves. The risk that we run here is that, I just have one headline from the Farming Independent here that highlights this. There's ever increasing pressure to eliminate calf export. And that's coming both internally and externally, I suppose. You've all seen the pressure that's on in the Dutch media there at the moment, or maybe you'll be aware of it anyway, that there's uproar basically in the Netherlands at the moment in relation to nitrates and emissions, and how there's downward pressure in relation to the size of the herds there. Obviously, they've been taking quite a number of calves from Ireland, and they had been quite happy with the calves that they were getting from Ireland. But the pressure that's on internally within the Netherlands is possibly going to see that avenue close off in terms of exports. Now, some of the other avenues, such as Spain, have probably picked up a little bit of the slack that has been created maybe within the Dutch market in recent times. But there is ever increasing pressure to stop calf export from a welfare point of view, just general concerns. And we've all seen the videos that get out there. They're one-off cases, or they're very limited cases. In the main, welfare in calves in Ireland is very, very high, and our mortality figures are very, very good, especially relative to some other countries. And you could argue all day that there is no justification probably to eliminate calf export, but I think it's just part of what we're looking at into the future, the calf export. We have to look at into the future and assume that calf export is eventually going to go. The other thing that's come in, and you'll all have seen it lately in the journal in particular, I suppose, is that the ICOS Calf Welfare Charter has been basically taken on by most of the co-ops now. And that's proposing that there will be a ban on the slaughter of calves less than 8 weeks of age. That's going to be brought in over the next 2 years, really. So it's coming into the milk purchasing terms and conditions for 2023, while the actual action of it will come into effect in 2024. So from the 1st of January 2024, there will be a ban on the slaughter of calves that are less than 8 weeks of age. The implications for this, if you don't adhere to this, is that your Bord Bia permission, basically your Bord Bia license to supply your co-op, or your requirement to have Bord Bia status with your co-op, is going to be compromised if you don't, if you're not failing to adhere to this rule. And that can potentially lead to a ban on collection, which will obviously have an impact in terms of milk having to be dumped and not being paid for milk as well. So ultimately, this is going to be a rule that's going to be enforced in 2024, and people will have to make adjustments to align with this. Now, this doesn't necessarily affect a huge number of herds, because there's only very few, very small percentage of herds actually in this category. However, it will probably affect them quite significantly. What's the impact of, I suppose, the changes in relation to both the export, if it were to go, and obviously the calf slaughtering? As I said, that's going to have a more immediate impact on some of those farms in the next couple of months, as they're expected to change their ways from 2023, really, if they want to keep in line with their Bord Bia status as well, with the ban coming into force in 2024. So look, in a minimum requirement, and I stress minimum requirement, calves require 1.5 square meters. So I'm about 6 foot tall. If I take a step, that's about 1 meter. So if I step out 1.5 meters and I step another 1.5 meters, you can actually just create that scenario for yourself as to how much space you need. It's very, very important that people are aware of this. The other thing, as I said, that 1.5 meters is the minimum legislative requirement that you have. And work that's been done on calf health and so forth by Emer and her colleagues down here, Alison Sinnott would have been one of the other people that's done a lot of work in this area with Emer, would show that the more space that calves have available to them, there's a greater chance that they won't become sick. So a reduced risk of illness by having more space. So generally the recommendation is actually that they would have 2 meters square available to them. But as I said, the 1.5 is the minimum legislation that's required. So I suppose for people that are under pressure for space, 1.5 is your objective in the short term, but the 2 meters is probably something that needs to be aimed for by the vast majority of farms. The second category of space that's required is airspace. And for calves up to 2 months of age, that's going to come into the shape of 7 cubic meters. So again, how do you work that out? It's basically length by breadth by height of the building that you're working in. And literally the lower of these two numbers is your shed capacity. So you could have huge floor space, but don't have adequate airspace. The airspace is the figure that dictates the numbers of calves that go into that shed. Conversely, you could have quite a high shed, which would have a large cubic air capacity, but actually mightn't have the floor space that you require. So then in that case, the lower figure there is going to be your floor space, and that dictates the number of the calves that go into that shed. And that's something that people need to be very conscious of, okay? And I suppose where this is going to impact is if we look at this table here, and I'll just try and bring up a pointer here now just to highlight. So if we look at this, in many cases, and I suppose this is no reflection on, this is any calves really, we'll say when we talk about beef calves here, we're talking about Frisian bulls, obviously retaining our replacements on the farm, or any beef breed at all there. So look, as I said, all along, I suppose the objective has been to probably focus on the dairy side, get the calves that are surplus to requirement on the farm off the farm as quickly as possible. And that has in itself led to a situation where we're a little bit tight on housing. And I suppose if we ended up with a scenario where we have Anne and her colleagues telling us that we have a TB breakdown and we're operating on the basis of eliminating or removing these animals from our herd as quickly as possible in terms of sales, if we end up with a TB breakdown and we're forced to retain these animals, as we will be in that situation, we're now in a very dire position in terms of capacity. As I said, talking about the export possibly going and the fact that the slaughter is going to be banned from 2024 will also create problems on farms in that, depending on your 6-week calving rate, well, actually, it doesn't really depend on your 6-week calving rate because it's all relative, to be honest. But if we, with high 6-week calving rates, the longer we're keeping calves on the farm before we move them, the greater the capacity of space that's required, and obviously that stands to reason. And as I said, the actual 6-week calving rate doesn't really matter. So from the point of view of if it's actually the time frame that we're keeping the calves on the farm is going to have a greater impact on the actual amount of space that we need. So I'm just going to move on to an example. Just, I suppose, nationally, we're talking about roughly 100 cows in herds across the country at this stage. We've moved up gradually over the last number of years. And if we take the 90%, which is our industry target, obviously, and lots of people are achieving that, and then there are many people that are still striving to achieve that. And as I said, that as often used as an excuse, in like if we cut back the 6-week calving rate, then we probably get away with it. But if we think about it in logical terms, just because we have a few less cows calved, the time frame that we're keeping these calves increases, it means we still end up with the same number of calves on the ground or very close to it, in spite of our 6-week calving rate. So I suppose from an ease of management point of view, while it's torture probably at the time that it's happening, to calve more of these in a shorter space of time is actually the quickest way to go, I suppose, in terms of getting through the period. So as I said, if we take this 100 cow example, calving 90% in 6 weeks and selling the calves at either 2 weeks of age or at 4 weeks, just using the percentages that I've shown you on the previous table there. We work off the first one where we're selling them at the 2 weeks of age. 55% of that 100 animals is obviously 55. The space that's the peak number that we're going to have at that stage if we're selling the calves at 2 weeks of age. We also need to bear in mind now that most people, with the best will in the world, we're not selling a calf the day they turn 14 days or 15 days. There's a group of them being put together and then they're moving. So in reality, this 55 is a bit fictitious in that that's not going to be exactly that. You're going to need more space than that. So 55 by 1.5 meters. Again, bearing in mind that that's just a minimum requirement, that's 82.5 square meters. If we move on to our selling at 4 weeks, we're gone up to 72% of our stock going to be on hand at any one time in that scenario. So obviously 72 animals, 72 by 1.5 is 108 square meters. The difference between the two of those is 25.5 square meters, which is 5 by 5. And just to put that in context for people, a standard bay is 4.85 meters, or for people who deal in feet, that's 15'9" is a standard bay. Okay, so you're looking at kind of somewhere in the region of 16-foot square kind of type facility required there. Even a little width, it's probably closer to 17 feet square required to make up the difference in that scenario. So if you're in the scenario where you're moving the calves at a very fairly rapidly off the farm as they hit the 2 weeks of age kind of scenario, and we're looking at something longer term, in terms of 4 weeks requirement maybe, and as I said, that IFSA report is saying 5 weeks, then you can see that there's going to be an increase in the requirement for space in relation to calf housing. Okay, and again, this all increases more if I make that 2 meters, then obviously our 55 requires the same space as is required by our 72 in this scenario. And if I multiply my 72 by 2 here, I'm going to need 144 square meters, which is closer probably to nearly two bays in reality. So just to, I suppose, look at what possible solutions are, and there's a lot of solutions on farms in a lot of cases. And again, referring back to Alison Sinnott, Alison did a study there a couple of years ago where she looked at farms in advance of the calving season and then went back again. And lots of farms have sheds identified that they could actually use to create a bit of extra space for calves if needs be. May not always be using it, and that's what Alison found when she went back during the calving season. Some of these sheds weren't actually being used. So if you don't have sufficient space, you need to create it pretty much. What way you go about it will vary depending on what you have. There's quite often options within the yard. So machinery sheds, I very regularly go into farms and see tethers, mowers, fertilizer spreaders stored in sheds. And look, can understand why that is. It's obviously makes them last a little bit longer, but obviously we can put them out in the yard for the month of February and maybe the month of March as well. You could have them stored in there until you need them. Obviously, you have your own existing calf house in the short term that's going to work for you for possibly a good bit of the month of February. But we do need that extra space capacity for maybe second half of February, definitely for most of the month of March. Hay barns are other options. So as we're maybe using straw out of them, we might be creating space in them. They can be modified in such a way that they can be quite healthy locations to rear calves. So maybe some windbreakers. Bales of straw themselves actually work as very good panels around calves. And the wind actually blows right over them in a lot of cases. Now, again, you need something to break the breeze there, but you stop a draft at a low level and you actually create quite a nice environment for a calf to be reared in. And that breeze across the top of the bales can actually be it works as a biocide, basically removing any stale air that's being generated from the calves. And it leads to quite healthy scenarios for calves as well. So do consider the options that are available there to you. Many of you will already be using calving areas, maybe as calving eases off, so you're going to have to look at other options. But if calving area isn't being utilised as a calf area currently, it may offer potential as well in that area. Again, as we're talking about, can we tighten up on the calving area and give more space to calves at that stage, just to create the space? It is important to point out, it would be remiss of me to talk about this, machinery sheds obviously generally don't have compliance in terms of nitrates, and possibly not hay barns as well. But some small investment, maybe a small little precast tank or something, and some channels to direct the flow to that from the shed. Obviously, these will be roofed facilities, so we're not worried about rainwater falling on these. And what we're talking about in terms of actual quantities of urine and dung that will be generated here will be relatively small, as you know. So we can maybe modify something to suit without major cost in that scenario. So I suppose it's important that people act now. Like, the biggest mistake that people will make is to pack calves into insufficient space. And that's important to point out. That's either in insufficient floor space or air space, as I've spoken about already. And people need to look at options to accommodate calves on your farm for 2023. And then I suppose if we look back and look at what we've said about maybe the potential for the exports to be either delayed or stopped altogether, maybe, and as I said, with people where maybe people had been utilising the slaughter side of things, that avenue is going to be gone as well. And longer term, there's going to be a requirement for more space on farms for calves, and people need to put that in place. The reality is that by doing this, it will actually make your life a little bit easier by making the space. So just be prepared, I suppose. Clean out any sheds that you're going to use. So as I said, those machinery sheds, or we look, the hay sheds, are generally clean and dry in a lot of cases, but maybe just disinfecting them before you would actually go to use them. Colostrum is key. Remember that colostrum 1, 2, 3 rule that we've often talked about in the last number of years in particular. And again, just I suppose if I refer back to some of the export stock, I know that some of our people, would say both DAF and staff and Teagasc people, have been abroad. And the comments that have come back from the people that are buying those calves, the exported calves, is that they are really, really happy with the quality of the stock that they're getting in terms of their immunity and their health from the Irish market, because our enforcement or our drive around colostrum over the last number of years is paying dividends in that area. So I suppose just to further improve calf health, we've added a 4th, 5th and 6th step to it now that I'll show you in a second. This is courtesy of Emer Kennedy, as I said, and the rest of her team. So the calf 1 to 6 rule now is encompassing the 1, 2, 3. So we're not changing it too much. We're going to keep the first bit simple, straightforward. So that first milking, so really colostrum is only from the very first milking after the cow is calved. And I suppose we need to bear in mind as well that if cows calve during the night, and they're not milked for a long period until maybe the following morning, maybe if they're the last cows coming into the parlour in the following morning, it could be quite a period of time since they were actually calved, and the quality of their colostrum actually can drop quite significantly in that window. So we need to be maybe conscious, albeit being cautious around the whole Iones piece as well, that it may be better to give colostrum that we know is of high quality to that freshly born calf as soon as they get it, if we're not going to milk that cow and feed that calf that colostrum fairly quickly after birth. So as I said, the 1 stands for first milking. 2 stands for feed it within 2 hours. And this is probably a big challenge for farmers, obviously, during the springtime, quite a busy period, very tiring period of time. And it's hard to keep this rule in vogue the whole way through the calving season. But it will pay dividends where people can kind of work around. I know several guys that I've been dealing with there in the last while, they're maybe getting their wife or their children to actually do maybe the late night check on the cows, so the 10, 11 o'clock check on the shed. And that facilitates them going to bed a little bit earlier, which allows them then to, if they check a camera and see that there's a calf born, they're not as absolutely wrecked as they would be if they were after staying up to do that late night check themselves. And that facilitates them going out and seeing after calves. And look, it is a big challenge, but it's important. And I'll show you why it is important in a minute. I suppose this Brix refractometer, look, I think you can buy them from anywhere from 25 to 40 euro probably online. Pretty sure Grasstech actually are selling them at the moment. They have been hard to acquire in an Irish context for the last number of years, but they are available through the lads, I think. What's highlighted here is when you look through the eyepiece. So we use this in Teagasc for just testing the sugar level in grass when we're suggesting whether you should be, whether you're ready to go cutting silage or not. And it can also be used from the point of view of testing milk or testing colostrum for its quality. So you place the drop colostrum on here, you look through the eyepiece, and we're looking for a value that's greater than 22% here in order to be suitable for calves to be fed. And it's something that we should try to get into a routine of doing, is just very quickly testing the colostrum that we've harvested from the cow to see, is it fit for feeding to a newborn calf. And as I said, okay, we have to be conscious of iones as well, but where we're okay from a iones point of view, maybe we're better off to, or we will be better off to feed known high quality colostrum from known iones free cows to a calf, rather than feeding their own dams colostrum to them if they're actually delivering poor quality colostrum. That poor quality colostrum doesn't have to be dumped. It can actually be used then as second, third feed, kind of that scenario which we'll pick up on in a minute. But it's just not suitable for that very first feed. The third point, number 3, is basically to feed 3 litres. So all calves need to get at least 3 litres of that high quality colostrum. What it does is it fills them up. It blocks all the spaces on their stomach basically, so that they're absorbing that, and we're eliminating the risk of them consuming some dung maybe from the area that they're born into, or maybe the area that they're put into subsequently, which will latch onto the lining of their stomach and be the first thing to be absorbed. If we can beat that in with high quality colostrum, then we're off to a flyer in terms of the start that calf is going to get. So what's 4, 5 and 6 going to? 4 represents 4 feeds of transition milk, and as I said, if we have that low quality colostrum that isn't suitable as the first feed, we could actually throw that in to be fed as a transition milk feed. So 4 feeds of that would mean that for milkings 2 to 6, we're going to feed the calves another 2 to 3 litres, 2 to 2.5 litres of that probably for those 2 days post being born. And that's just further ensuring that they're getting some bit of actual antibody as well. While the absorption level has dropped off quite significantly at that stage, I suppose there's still an advantage in putting that in there. And I suppose for people that are vaccinating for rotavirus and coronavirus and K99 E. coli, it's important that they do get some of that transition milk, because just the 1 feed of colostrum on its own isn't going to be adequate to transfer immunity. In reality, they would, talking to the drugs companies, they would suggest that you would feed transition milk for longer in order to get full benefit from it. But at least if you get some of that transition milk in, it's going to be a better start than you would be otherwise. And look, the reason for that is that they've found that there's less signs of poor health when transition milk is fed. So we have droopy ears here, and maybe a kind of a dead eye and a runny eye here, and runny noses as well, as examples of those lesser signs of health, okay? So the 5 is 5 litres of transition milk. So we're talking about filling them up 3 to 5 litres of colostrum in the first feed, and then moving them on to, so they're obviously relatively small in terms of what they can take. Some calves can drink more, but the vast majority of calves will probably at best drink about 5 litres probably for the first couple of days after they're born. And then we're moving them on to 6 litres of high quality either whole milk or milk replacer once they're a week old. Now again, logistics around that are going to be a bit challenging in terms of what age is this calf as I pour my milk in to feed him. You're not going to know exactly, but We do have to have the objective of trying to give the 5 litres of transition milk to the young calves, and when they start to move on, then we need to feed 6 litres in order to get them growing well, because the more of it we give them, the better that they grow at that stage, to get really good value for it, and they convert quite well at that stage. And it's a high quality milk, obviously, so that's dependent on what the diet is, obviously, of the cow. And a high quality milk replacer, as you can see here, is going to be 23 to 26% protein, 16 to 20% oil, and I suppose less than 0.15% for fibre and less than 8.5% for ash. If we have a higher ash content here, it's probably suggesting that we're have a lot of plant-based material in the milk replacer, which isn't readily digestible. These should be based on high levels of milk ingredients. That will make milk replacer more expensive, but it is a better milk replacer that you're purchasing in that scenario. So look, finally, the importance of hygiene. I suppose coming back to why the colostrum is so important, there is no transfer of immunoglobulins between, which is our antibodies basically, between the cow and calf. So as you can see here, that red line represents that there's a barrier here between the cow and the calf, that calf through the placenta is being separated from the maternal blood supply. So there's no antibody transferring across. That's different to humans. Humans actually do get antibodies through the placenta. So that calf hits the ground, they're completely naive in terms of immunity. So the type of ground that they hit when they calve is going to be critical, obviously. So like the first thing that we're going to see is the type of bedding that they're calving down into. So is it a clean bed or is it a dirty bed? And I suppose it's important to point out that the first thing a calf is going to do a lot of times once they're born is try to stand up. And the first thing that they do when they try to stand up is fall down. And that means that their face plants into a dirty environment, as we can see here on the right maybe, or if it's into a more, like this is still a dirty environment here on the left-hand side. If they fall into that dirty environment, they're coming into contact with feces, and that means that, as I said, we're losing the race against time to beat the bad bacteria into their gut. If we get the colostrum into them and they're born in a clean environment such as this, then we've started on a very strong footing in terms of the health of that animal. Okay, so just to summarize, calf movements themselves are unchanged for 2023. 2024, obviously, as I said, is the ban on the slaughter, so that's going to make an impact on some farms. Calves need space, and you need to know what you need for your calves. And it's as simple as getting out the measuring tape, measuring the area that you have available for them. For simplicity, just divided by 2. It's a simple number to remember. As I said, the legislation requires 1.5, but divided by 2. How many calves do you expect to have on hand? How much space have you for them? If you don't have enough space, you're going to need to create that space, or you need to find a way to reduce your space requirement. In the short term, you can get away with that because the calf can move off at 10 days of age. You may be able to sell that calf on day 11 and reduce the space requirement in that sense. However, longer term, we are going to need to plan to have more space on farms, okay? And look, that calf 1 to 6 rule will improve calf health on your farm. Calf health has improved dramatically on Irish farms over the last 10 years, I suppose. And it's a very, very good reflection on the work that farmers are doing, that calf health has improved. But it's a job that has to be worked at. And I suppose creating both the facilities for that and actually trying to provide the labour, whatever that is, be it family labour or employed labour, to try and make sure that calves get the requirements that they need to stay healthy is a very important piece. So I'll leave it at that, Ruth, Noel, and I'll take any questions if you want.
That's great. Thank you very much, Stuart. I think, Owen, you have a few questions come in both for Stuart and for Anne, so I'll hand over to you.
Okay, I'll deal with Stuart first, just since his presentation just finished. One question came in here: how do you get high quality colostrum over 22? What factors affect it? He has been tested, he said, colostrum over a number of years, and he's finding it hard to get it at 22 or above.
Yeah, so there's variation there. We'll say the lactation status of the cow is going to be an influence in that as well. So heifers can actually struggle to hit high quality colostrum in some cases. But the other thing that can also impact on it is the timing of milking post calving as well. So as I said earlier, the sooner that the cow is actually milked post calving is going to be a positive in terms of actual the bricks figure that we get back there. The other thing that's obviously critically important to getting quality colostrum is actually the nutrition of the dry cow during the dry cow period. So the actual mineral status of the cow is important. So we need to feed a good dry cow mineral. We also need to feed relatively good quality silage. So your standard 68, 69 DMD should be good enough in terms of energy because it's suitable for putting on condition on cows. However, where we can slip up here sometimes is actually in relation to protein levels. And yourself and Ruth will have seen that there, that we've seen silage tests coming back in the last number of years that kind of defy a bit of logic in terms of they can be very high dry matter and high DMD, but their protein levels are a little bit on the low side. So if we find that we've low protein levels, we need to supplement protein. And some farmers will feed small amounts of maybe oats and soya maybe to cows in advance of calving just to boost up colostrum. Some vets recommend that across the country. Other vets won't recommend it. But there, if you're consistently finding that you're struggling to get high quality colostrum, you need to maybe look at the diet side of things because, as I said, while you'll have variation within the herd, if it's across the whole herd, there must be something at play in terms of nutrition maybe that's undermining it.
Sorry, I'll just mention it as well too. We have a number of people that have put up hands on the participant section. We're not able to take questions at root, but if you use the chat box or you use the Q&A box, we'll be able to sort it that way. Because of the fact that it's a webinar, we can't take questions via that route. So if you please use the Q&A box, we'll be able to answer your question or direct them to the relevant speaker. Have we anything further for?
Okay, Ruth. Yeah, there's another question there for Stuart in relation to outdoor hutches for maybe older calves to take pressure off of calving houses. They're okay, Stuart, or what's the nitrates compliance issue with them? Or
yeah, sure. That's the biggest issue with them on is probably the nitrates compliance. So I've seen it work very well in one yard where the silage yard is used, and they put about 10 hutches onto it. And obviously there's a collection facility around that. Now there is a large volume of effluent, I suppose, diluted effluent, you can say, even is collected through that. But it is a solution to get people out of trouble in the short term, all right. In that particular case, that farmer was inclined to do exactly as I said, not to do there in one of my final slides there, packing calves into the shed. And when he brought on the hutches onto the silage pit, he found a dramatic influence in terms of the calf health, because basically what he was doing was he was keeping his number right in the calf house that he had. So like a lot of people, I suppose, maybe through expansion, the herd size has exceeded the capacity of the calf shed that was originally built for the original herd size. And that's where the problems are coming. So they do work, but the nitrates compliance is something that has to be adhered to. And also obviously look, just because they're outside in a hutch, they need to be bedded equally as much. And I've heard some people talking about some of the hutches maybe having opening chutes at the back that allow for bedding to be put in at the back to make it easier to bed them and so forth. And they do need to be cleaned as well. So I suppose maybe locking calves into the pen, taking up the hutch and cleaning away the bed and putting down a fresh bed is important as well.
Any comments? Another question for you, Stuart. Any comments in relation to housing calves in a common airspace with older stock? You say maybe weanlings or yearlings or cows even.
Yeah, sure. Like there's a general thought process there that it's a bad thing to do anyway. That obviously I suppose if you take RSV and PI3 in particular, I know looking at many of your clients there will have been involved in the Munster Herd Health programs in the past there as well, where they were looking at RSV and PI3 in the cows, and they stopped doing it because it's so ubiquitous in herds that there was no advantage to it. So everybody was basically showing up with high levels of RSV and PI3. And people will be conscious of it now that it's in the media there lately in relation to kids picking up these RSV infections. So they're actually naturally occurring, but obviously what they are is they tend to piggyback. So if we're putting pressure on stock in terms of calf spaces and so forth like that, and they're slightly immunocompromised as a result of just being slightly stressed, maybe due to lack of space and so forth, the likes of RSV and PI3 can jump in and take advantage of that stress level. And because older stock are going to have it, by putting the younger stock in close proximity to them, it's going to increase the risk or the chances of them getting it. The only thing I would suggest there on is it's the 7th of December today. People can't turn around and build calf houses between here and calving in most cases anyway. The reality of it is that there are vaccines available to cover off the likes of that. And I suppose if we can do the best we can in terms of having our rotavirus and so forth covered, and look, vaccination is the route to trying to reduce antibiotic usage as much as possible. We do our vaccinations well and give that space, so bear that figure of the 1.5 or the 2 meters and the airspace in mind, will position stock to be a lot more robust and resilient to these kind of challenges. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Maybe can I just bring Anne maybe in on a question there? Would the department consider appointing one person from the department to each herd that breaks down with TB, that it would help the farmer, you know, to have a more consistent contact within the department, you know, in terms of going through the process of they should follow that. If they had a kind of one person to deal with, that would make the system maybe a little more farmer friendly.
Because that's a very good question, Owen. Can you hear me there?
Yes, and we can
Yeah.
hear fine. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yes.
Look,
yes.
I suppose at an RVO level, I suppose to explain, I suppose the veterinary and technical staff are very involved in the disease investigation and the management of the infection spread within the family farm. So our primary role is to find out what caused the TB, to identify any residually infected animals. We'll do additional testing. We'll do checks on the farm. You know, we look at wildlife and we look at all the causation factors for the TB breakdown. In general terms, the valuation process and the compensation is managed by a different stream. So that we are very conscious that it is very difficult for people to negotiate, I suppose, all the paperwork and all the different individuals. So we are looking, I suppose, within Kilkenny and Waterford to see, can we improve our communications and our, I suppose, our paperwork streams to make it a little bit easier to negotiate. I'm not sure in the short term, could we commit to giving one person, you know, I suppose, the overall responsibility per individual breakdown. But what we could say is that we will certainly look at improving, I suppose, our general communication and making the whole breakdown process easier to negotiate, you know, going forward, because we are conscious of it. Yeah. So I hope that's a start anyway, because we are aware that it is quite difficult.
Yes. Okay. Thanks. And just one other comment there, just in relation to, you know, TB, we know who the farmers are when they do get a breakdown. But what are the department doing in relation to, we say, areas like national parks and we say non-farmer areas where there's, you know, we say the possibility of deer and badgers and everything roaming around, and you know, are they monitored in any sense or controlled?
But I think it's a huge issue now. I think we're very fortunate here in Kilkenny and Waterford. I think I had a meeting there with farmers in North Kilkenny last week. And I suppose the first thing I'd say is you're very fortunate if you have everyone around you involved in commercial farming. In East Wicklow, you know, non-commercial farming and I suppose recreational land use is a huge issue, and there are other stakeholders. So the TB Stakeholder Forum is, I suppose, that's the area where the department are trying to pull in, I suppose, Coillte, Parks and Wildlife, and all of the other bodies and the private, I suppose, recreational land use owners to get, I suppose, a greater awareness, in particular for deer management, but also access for I suppose, the badger program. I mean, I suppose it's really important for everyone to realize that we're sharing the badgers. So badgers in particular, but we're also sharing the deer. So it'll be a collective approach. Just because you're doing everything right on your farm, if your neighbours haven't bought in to looking after, I suppose, the wildlife on their farms, you know, potentially that's a threat to your farm as well, and vice versa. So no, we are very conscious of it now, and I suppose the stakeholder forum is really starting to look at that and to pull in everybody, you know, into the picture on it.
And one final question, we'll take this maybe route as the last question for Anne. Is there a link between increased badger population due to vaccination and the spread of TB?
Right. Okay. Well, I suppose that has come up now. I suppose just to flag, I suppose the
You
North
know,
Kilkenny
is the
area.
population of badgers increasing because of more vaccination, and is that causing the spread of TB as well?
Well,
yes.
It's, to be very clear, I suppose TB is a very complex disease, and there certainly isn't going to be one easy answer. I mean, it would be great to say, look, if we reduce the badger numbers, we're going to get rid of TB and it's going to solve all our problems. And I think what we can very clearly see, it's an evolving situation on I suppose, the modern Irish dairy farm now, whether you're dairying, whether you're suckler, or whether you've a beef enterprise. And I think badgers are in the hedgerows. Look at their numbers haven't substantially increased. I think there is always a worry like, oh gosh, we're vaccinating them, so the numbers are going to be huge and they're going to be encroaching in on commercial farmland. Look at badgers are very stable. They pretty much do the same things. What upsets badgers is damage to their environment or encroaching in. So the motorways, putting in simple terms, putting in new sheds, putting in new walkways. So anything that causes disturbance of badgers will cause badger movement. And that's definitely linked to increases in TB incidents in specific areas. So it's just really important for everyone to realize that, you know, an increase in population, if they're healthy, are absolutely no risk at all to commercial farming. Just there on the 42-day test and for the calves. And I suppose, look, we did ask the same question. I think at RVO level, we certainly recognised over COVID that the health and I suppose the movement and management of calves at farm level and presentation in marts certainly was much better, and there were better farm to farm movements because more local farmers were buying calves off farm when they were a little bit older. Now, unfortunately, ERAD are very clear that the programme states that calves must be tested before they leave the farm if they're over 42 days. So I'm afraid there's no movement on it. But what I would say is, I suppose, not to be afraid of doing the TB test and hold on to them for a little longer.
I think that's all our questions, Owen, is it?
Yeah.
Yes, that's all, Ruth. Yeah, I think
Great.
we're fine now. We're good.
Great. Look, just on behalf of the team in Kilkenny Waterford from Teagasc, I'd like to hugely thank our two speakers, Anne Quinn and Stuart Childs, for joining us here this evening. And I hope from Anne's point of view that we meet you from a preventive point of view rather than an outbreak point of view in the future. And a big thanks also to Stuart for updating us on those. And look, as Stuart said, we still have a number of weeks, and in a lot of cases, there's a lot of sheds on farms that could be drafted in for extra use. So it's a matter of looking at those options coming forward through. So look, I'd also just like to thank my colleagues Owen Power and Eamon Lynch for joining us this evening, and to doing the technical bits and the Q&As in the background as well too, and to thank all of you for joining us. We wish you all a very happy Christmas coming up, and all the best for the new year. And please remember that your Teagasc advice are here, so if we can be of any assistance, please give us a call. Okay, so we'll finish at that, and thank you very much all for joining us.